You are our first ever recording in this studio. So I've done podcasts before on Zoom, but we've only ever been keeping the audio. So
first ever virtual guest.
First ever virtual guest is the technical,
Okay.
So you're on a laptop on a table in front of us in our studio. and then we're gonna see how this works, because we'd like to do this often, but this is our sort of, from a tech point of view, our first trial run at it. So I think we're good to go.
I think so.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay, so here we go in 3, 2, and 1.
I'm Deacon Eric.
And I'm Dr. Brett Salkeld.
And you're listening to Thinking Faith. This is a podcast brought to you by the Archdiocese of Regina, where we attempt to navigate this winding road of faith in Jesus Christ so that we might know Him more intimately, love Him more profoundly, and together serve Him more deeply in our daily lives.
Welcome, everyone, to another week of Thinking Faith. This is a great week, kind of groundbreaking for our new format in studio. We've got a virtual guest with us, joining us today from Franciscan University in Steubenville. Is that right, Daniel?
That's right, in Ohio.
Yeah, very, very great to have you with us, Daniel. And Brett, you have had some interactions together, and do you want to just set things up for us?
Sure, yeah. So Dan and I have done a little work through the McGrath Center. Actually, our friends at Notre Dame there, or McGrath Institute. I get that wrong all the time. The McGrath Institute. I think during COVID, stuff around vaccines and that sort of thing. I'm a theologian, Dan's a biologist. And so a lot of the faith and science stuff we've had interactions on. Yeah. And recently, and we'll let Dan share the story, there was an incident that got a lot of action on Facebook about a debate that never did end up happening at Steubenville. And it raised a lot of interesting questions about faith and science and when to debate and who and how and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And as I was watching things shake out on social media, I thought, well, I would just love to talk to Dan about his experience and his decisions and his logic and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And so I reached out to him to see if he would be willing to do that. Not as we said before we pressed the record button, not to engage in muckraking, but to think through these things more carefully, because they're often done in a very simplistic way online. So I reached out to Dan and he agreed to be here. So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. Why don't you start by telling, before we get into the situation, tell us a little about who you are, the kind of work you do, and I would say particularly with reference to the faith science question, because you've done quite a bit of work on there and have some resources out that might be helpful to our audience. So maybe just start with introducing yourself and your work in that field.
Yeah, well, great. Thanks, guys, for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you guys and talk about these at least to me, interesting subjects. So I've been at Steubenville here now 23 years. I'm a biologist. I'm a cell biologist by trade, but I've always been interested in the intersection of faith and science, particularly around evolution. That's what really first got me sort of interested. I remember reading books about this in graduate school back in the late 90s and thinking these things through. And I ended up co-publishing a book that came out in 2007 called The Evolution Controversy. It's more of a scientific book. We look at different scientific theories. We look at creationism, creationism science, or how they try to reconcile the science with that, intelligent design, sort of meta-Darwinism, the extended evolutionary synthesis, and then Darwinism, and just look at those. So what does the evidence show, and how do we think through these things in a reasonable fashion? But as you think through these things about evolution, you also start to think about theological issues as a Catholic. So how do you reconcile evolution with some of the truths of the Catholic faith? And so I started giving talks on that and writing small articles about that, and been doing that, particularly for the last 10 years. And I have a book coming out in Word on Fire Press, Darwin and Doctrine, will come out in 2025, the end of the summer here in August. So, and that book really is sort of the culmination of a lot of the work I've done. And it's a lot of the conversations I've had with students, had with theologians, philosophers, other faculty members here at Franciscan and beyond, high school teachers who have questions about how do we talk about the faith and evolution. But I do work on adult stem cells, and so I have a lot of work in sort of bioethics as well. So I've written on that, just sort of the bioethical issues, like, we were talking about the COVID vaccine, we talk about adult stem cells, cloning, that type of in vitro fertilization, and what's the science behind that, and why does the church have certain concerns with some of this sort of the new biotech technologies that are coming out fast and furious, and it's only getting bigger as we start to see like transhumanism raise its head with sort of mind-brain interfaces and all that stuff. But I know today we'll probably focus on evolution in the faith, and that's sort of what I think my favorite topic to talk about, the thing to think about, and think about sort of these deep questions about what does it mean that the humans are part of this evolutionary trajectory, at the same time being made in the image and likeness of God, and how do we think about those things in a coherent way?
Excellent. Well, it sounds like we could just start a new podcast.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
And have a whole series with you, and maybe we'll have you back, because a lot of that I think would be of a lot of interest to our audience. But as you said, for today we have a more contained sort of situation to discuss and topics related to creation and evolution. So a few months ago, and I'll let you share the details. A few months ago, you were invited to debate creationists or creationists in a sort of student-sponsored event at the University of Steubenville. And then that sort of blew up on the internet, on social media, in Catholic circles, and eventually the event was canceled and all that kind of stuff. Why don't you tell us, the relevant details, and then after we have some of that background, then we can start thinking through some of the questions that emerge, when you're asked to take part in these debates or when controversy erupts around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great. So we have a student sort of debate society called the Veritas Society on campus. I honestly don't know if that's something that's just unique to Franciscan, the Veritas name, or if it's a bigger society, or if they just sort of founded that. But what they have done in the past, still have, just interesting debates on a variety of topics, and they'll have usually a faculty member on one side and a faculty member on the other side. And sometimes faculty members agree with what they're debating. Other times they're not really sure, but they're just willing to, take that position and debate. And it's more of a, sort of a raucous debate, kind of like what you see in the British Parliament type of debate. It's try to be sort of entertaining, take on an interesting topic, about something that might be a little bit controversial. And so I was asked to debate. To participate in debate about evolution. And I think the question is evolution the best explanation for the origin of humans, yes or no? And obviously it's a more complicated question than that, but they have sort of a simple, sort of catchy phrase. And so when I agreed to do it, I said, well, yeah, just let me know who I'm debating. And I just assumed it would be a faculty member here on campus who would be taking the other position. And they didn't know yet who it would be, but I said, yeah, I can do that, and be happy to be part of it. It was meant for our campus. It would be, our faculty members doing it. And then a few days before, the organizer came to me and said, you know what, we found out who you're debating. You're going to be debating this person from a creationist society. So it wasn't a faculty member, it was somebody from outside the university. And it was a Catholic creationist, a young earth creationist society. Mm. And there was going to be two members. One of them was from this society. And so I was, a little concerned. I said, well, why are we bringing this person in? Are we paying for this person to come in? It seems, I thought I was going to be debating a faculty member. I thought this was sort of in-house. I don't know know if we want to be associated with, this Catholic creationist group, and to be sponsoring them to be on campus. Not that, I was fine with debating a faculty member. And in fact, I've debated a faculty member in the past who was an anti-evolutionary view and more of a creationist view, was a faculty member. And, we're not paying, it's sort of an intellectual discussion in front of students. So I've done that a couple of years ago. So, but the idea of bringing somebody in from outside who, some of the views I think are problematic, not only from an intellectual reason, but from theological reasons. I was a little bit concerned about that. And so I raised my concerns, and things, started to blow up on Facebook. And I was like, look, we're already getting bad publicity for this as people see, they put up flyers and so forth. And so, I don't think we want to be associated with sort of a creationist sort of ideology, I think. And so that was what caused me to say, hey, maybe we should cancel the debate. I didn't want to back out because I didn't want to the creationists, they're afraid to debate me, he's backing out. But the students decided, okay, yeah, we're going to cancel the debate. And I think in the students' credit, they didn't really know what they were getting into.
Right.
They thought, this is just, I have no fault. I guess students didn't cross the T's and dot the I's, but it wasn't like something nefarious by the students, and they didn't think through the bigger issues that were going on here. They just thought this would be an interesting, controversial debate that would get a lot of people in the seats for their event, and they didn't really think beyond that. So, I sympathize with them, and I'm grateful that they saw, that it might be best just to end or to cancel the debate. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff going back on Facebook, as Brett, you mentioned, people saying, well, why don't they just debate? If this is an interesting time, why don't they just talk? And other people, how could you ever invite a creationist to campus? This is, you guys are anti-science and so forth. And that to me was the thing that I was concerned, just the impression that we were giving as a university, more so than, we should never have a debate of this type.
Right. There's a couple things. One, it's very helpful to get the context that this was a well-intentioned student group that maybe didn't think through all the implications, because at first blush on social media, it looks like the university did this and had to back down, or maybe shouldn't have backed down. And that's a whole different kind of thing. The considerations that a university makes before inviting a speaker is different than what you'd expect of a student group. So I think it's just handy to get that context. And I wonder, tell me if I'm right about this. So this was supposed to be like 2-on-2, and the other opponent, so not your partner, but the partner of this creationist, also didn't know who they had signed up to be a partner with, and withdrew their name when they found out. Is that correct, or is there some nuance you would introduce there?
That's what I was told. I never talked to that person, but that person was a faculty member at a different college who, when he was told that you're going to be on the side of a debate with this person from this Catholic Young Earth Creationist Society, was like, well, I wasn't told that. I didn't know that I don't want to be part of that. So he withdrew. He was has some issues with evolution, and so he was willing to sort of debate that evolution might not be correct as far as human evolution. I think was he thought there were some issues there, but he was not a young Earth creationist, and he was concerned that he was now on the side of a young Earth creationist. And so it seemed as if the student there was that runs the society had delegated to another student who had sort of creationist tendencies that he didn't realize, to find the speakers. And normally when you bring, even a student group, when they bring a speaker to campus, has to go through protocols to get it approved, and they never did. And again, I don't this was a new student leader of this group, and they were just restarting this. So I don't think he thought through everything and realized all the implications there. But and so the university had never approved of bringing these people to campus, and so that was another point that I made. And so that also, he realized, okay, maybe it's better just to cancel the whole thing, given they hadn't gone through the proper protocols, and there was a whole bunch of controversy going back and forth on Facebook on both sides of this. And and I believe there were still some follow up from the creationists who complained to other people that we were being silencing debate or something like that.
Right. Let's dive into the question of should you debate these people? But I wonder if I might just share a quick story. And we've not named names yet, so I'm going to tell the story without naming names. If people really want to go digging, they can probably find out, the names. But you said something about, like, it's not just debating in this case a scientific position; it's debating an ideology. And I think that distinction that you made is really important for understanding some of the decisions a person who's asked to engage in debate has to, some of the factors you have to consider when you're deciding whether to engage or not. It's maybe not as straightforward as, well, just show up and demonstrate how wrong they are, because there's other things going on. So here's my favorite story. This group has come after me in the past, so I've had some engagement with them. And when I went doing some digging on their history and their positions or whatever, I found this anecdote, which to me just really encapsulates something about what you're engaging with. They had written a review of a book by someone who was kind of sympathetic, maybe in a way that this second party was sympathetic to some critiques of evolution. But the book believed in a old universe, right? The universe is not 6,000 or 10,000 years old, but it's billions of years old. And so they went after this person and said, this is wrong. And now here's the irony: their namesake, the namesake of this institute, believed in an old universe. So the person who was being critiqued by them turned around and said to them, well, your namesake believed it in the scientific evidence for an old universe. And so either you should withdraw your critique of me, or you should change your name, if you want to be honest. And their response was was so illustrative of the attitude that you're dealing with here. Their response was, yes, we know that our namesake was wrong on this point. And now that he's dead and in heaven, he knows just how wrong he was. And so he is certainly praying fervently that we might correct his errors that he left here on earth, right? And therefore, we're keeping the name, and you're wrong about the age of the universe. And I just thought, if you can find a better example of, like, unrefutable engagement, I'll eat a hat of your choosing. Like, what do you do with that kind of thing? So I share that because I think it's worth recognizing. I think it's a great illustration of what you said. It's not just about debating the science, which is great. Let's debate the science. But there's also ideological factors that are shading how this works and shading how a person in your position has to make a decision about how you're going to engage, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly true, because a lot of this doesn't hinge so much on the scientific evidence or the scientific data. It hinges on sort of theological presuppositions or certain ideological commitments that people have, and so. I've seen debates, online and so forth between sort of creationists, Catholic creationists and non, and often they, have these attacks that are not so much against the scientific evidence, but against, well, obviously, if you believe in that, then therefore you're, think that pornography is okay, and you think this and that, and so it's like, and I'm like, well, I'm not here to defend pornography, Of course, I'm against pornography, here, but they're sort of tying you to, all of these other things and the next thing you know, the debate isn't about evolution. It's about, well, you're an atheist. Well, I'm not an atheist. So it really, it really behooves you to have a good format if you're going to debate and say, this is what we're going to stick to. This is what we're going to discuss. This is how the format's going to work. Because it's very easy for them to delve into the ideology behind their bias, and that's all the discussion becomes.
Right. Mm-hmm. secularist relativists believe in evolution. Therefore, if you accept evidence for evolution, you are an atheist secularist relativist, right? And then you're responsible for, I can't remember. There was a list of things that people like you and I who accept the evidence for evolution are responsible. It was the breakdown of the family because men are no longer the head of the household was one of them. The dissolution of the church's evangelical spirit because we dialogue with Protestants. Like, it was just this incredible list of things that followed from evolution that you thought, hold on. Is it a good use of my time at this point to actually talk about the cell biology or not, right?
Right. And that's the thing. They don't, when you get into arguments with them, often they don't explain why, if you believe in evolution, therefore you must believe in all these things, right? They just assume that those go hand in hand, that if you allow evolution in the door, then all of these other things are going to follow. And they'll often say, well, look, ever since evolution has become a viable scientific theory, the breakdown of the family has happened. This has happened. And they assume, well, there's a correlation there.
Yeah.
But they have no data to show that one is causing the other, and so you end up spending your time defending sort of Catholic teaching on the family. And so, well, no, I agree with that. But, and so it just doesn't really go anywhere often.
Right. You made the point that if you want to do this well, you need to set the parameters of the debate well. Right. And so what recommendations would let's say you're a student group who wants to host a debate. Let's say you're an academic who's being invited to the debate and you want to make sure the ground rules are clear before you accept. What kinds of parameters would you encourage people to have in place to make sure that this thing stays on the rails?
Yeah, I think so. I debated a faculty member here a couple of years ago, and we agreed, let's just debate the scientific evidence, right? And we're just going to stick to the science, and it's very hard to do that in front of a Catholic audience here at Franciscan, very committed Catholic students, because they're more concerned about, what does the faith say and how do we integrate this with understanding of the faith, or is it even possible, right? And so my advice, I think in a Catholic setting, the best type of debate to have is the debate about the theology and about how might this fit with a Catholic understanding of the human person and a Catholic understanding of creation. Because I think if you start debating the science, this is what I've found, most people don't understand what you're talking about, right? So you very quickly get to a point where people are not listening. They're like, I don't know what he's talking about. I don't understand that. I don't understand the genetics he's talking about. I don't understand that species of fossil that he's talking about, and so forth. So quickly, it's difficult to have that debate in front of, I found, students that are still struggling with the meta question, can you even fit this together, right? So if you go into a group of students who have this idea that, evolution is contrary to the Catholic faith, or at least human evolution. Yeah, maybe there's evolution of animals, but humans are different. They're set aside. They didn't evolve at all because it doesn't fit with the Catholic faith, right? They need to have a debate about, how might this fit with the Catholic? What has the Catholic Church said about this? How do we think about this? What have good Catholic thinkers thought about this, right? That debate to me is more interesting, right? And more foundational than once you open up this space to say, okay, yeah, I guess evolution could be reconciled with the Catholic faith. Seems like the church is open to that based on everything that we've talked about and debated here. Then that opens up the space for them to start to think about the evidence, right? And the scientific debate. And I think that's one of the things, and I found that we should have opened that debate with that faculty member, talking about what's the Catholic Church's position? How does it think about this? What does it say about this? What does it allow about this? And why does it allow that, right? The church's deep respect for scientific knowledge and scientific understanding, because science is done properly, it's going to uncover the beauty of God's creation. It's not going to contradict the beauty that has been revealed to us in the truths of the faith. And once people sort of have that understanding, I think it then opens up the opportunity to think about the science. But having debates about the science, for a lot of people, they're not there yet.
Right. It's very interesting. I'm thinking, like, you can't answer, if the audience is trying to answer a theological question, you can't answer it with a scientific answer. It won't land, right?
Yes.
But only once, and this is an interesting thing to notice, in our culture, we kind of all think of ourselves as like, we all believe the science, right? You know these lines, believe the science?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone who disagrees with you thinks they believe the science too, right? We all think we believe the science, but we're often very unaware of how our other non-scientific presuppositions are shaping our approach to the science. And so then it feels like quicksand, whether we're debating evolution or vaccines or whatever, we think we're debating about the science, but other considerations are sort of operating in the background, and we don't necessarily recognize them. And then we can't see how the other person could be so blind. How can they not? It's so obvious, you know? And I'm just thinking of one example. So an evolutionist sort of threw this at me, and it was the idea, look, you can't go from life to non-life because the first life would starve, having no other life to consume or metabolize, right? And so that seems like a very scientific thing to say, right? Life metabolizes other life. So even if by some miracle, you know, some rock became sentient, or, I mean, it's not a rock, but you know what I mean? Some amino acids started organizing themselves in a way that we would recognize as life, well, they would starve to death. And it just seems very plausible. Like it feels like a good question. If I was a 13-year-old hearing about abiogenesis for the first time, that would be a good question to explore. But the way it was presented was like, well, it's just a done deal. Like, they're going to starve and that's it. So then I did a Google search, and it turns out there are forms of life that metabolize non-life all over the planet. Like, it happens all the time. And the oldest life has been doing this for billions of years. And it's like, it's not even scientifically contentious. Like, you can just observe it, you know? But it's a great example of, like, you can throw out a scientific claim that if your audience wants to believe it, that looks really compelling, even if a cell biologist could come along and give you 20 examples to counter it.
Yeah. Now, that's one thing to keep in mind, that like, science is a human enterprise, right? And so this whole idea, just believe the science. Well, all scientific data has to be interpreted through some type of lens and philosophical system. And so there's always, you know, and again, I have to be honest with my own biases that I bring to interpreting scientific data, right? And those are both philosophical biases, they're personal biases, they're career biases, you know, and so recognizing that. And so often the data can be interpreted different ways. And sometimes it can be interpreted in different ways, and it's not clear which way is correct because it's not obvious, right? So you can always interpret data multiple ways. Sometimes, though, when you interpret data a different way, it just becomes so unwieldy as to be improbable to believe, right? But sometimes it isn't. So sometimes, there'll be, particularly in evolutionary biology, there's different ways of interpreting the data to know which species are more closely related to each other. So it's not a debate of whether they're evolved or related, but the way you look at the data, well, some people say the data is more consistent with this pattern. Other people say, well, the data is more consistent with that pattern, and they both believe they're correct because they're using different, they're prioritizing different values or different things to order the data, right? And so we have to recognize that we do that all the time as humans. That doesn't mean that you can't, tell that this way of organizing the data just doesn't make sense, because there's so many ad hoc things, that you have to put in there to make the system work. And you think about, in Galileo's time, eventually the whole idea that, the Earth was stationary and everything in the heavens was moving fell apart because there were so many ad hoc assumptions you had to make to keep the Earth at the center immobile. You can interpret the data that way. It just became so unwieldy that nobody could hold that anymore, right? So it's not as if, it's just relative, but we do have to recognize that we do have our biases that we bring to the data. When it comes to like young Earth creationists, I think they're in the same boat as, so you can try to interpret the data through a young Earth creationist lens and say, oh, and come up with some ad hoc ideas. Well, light was created in transit. Well, we know that star, we know the speed of light, we know that star, is this far away, this many light years away, so the Earth must be that old. Well, maybe the light, was created in transit, so it hasn't been traveling 10 billion years. It just got created, so it looks like that, right? Or radioactive decay used to be really, really fast right at the beginning of the universe, and now it's slowed down, right? We don't have any way of telling, but that makes, we can throw out all radioactive dating as being accurate then because of that. So you come up with these sort of ad hoc ideas that you can't prove or disprove, but it just like you throw out all these, certain later, the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, is that your framework for interpreting the data? It just doesn't fit, and it becomes so unwieldy as to be sort of unbelievable, right?
Right. I mean, the creationists have even, not to say every creationist, but as a movement, they have not been beyond saying fossils were put there by the devil to test your faith. I mean, that kind of thing has actually been claimed to try to square the circle, right? And like, light created in transit is already pushing it pretty far, but once the devil is planting fossils, you're like, and I remember this as a young person, right? I grew up in a household with creationist literature and stuff, and I was reading some of this stuff just thinking like, it's just not compelling unless you have to believe it for non-scientific reasons. That was the only way someone could find this compelling. And then when you actually scratch and ask the question, you find they'll often say that very explicitly. Yes, this must be true because we know this theologically or whatever the case may be, right?
And Brett, that gets to my point in the debates with these people. And one of the things that I've seen is that there's been a resurgence of sort of some form of creationists amongst younger people. I've seen it in the seminarians and in college students. It's a minority, but it's a distinct, but it's a growing minority. And this is where I think like debating the science isn't going to help because they have that commitment that you just mentioned, right? So no, evolution is contrary to the faith. And so therefore, no matter what, I've got to fit the data into a creationist mindset. So I don't even care. You tell me about this fossil, whatever, and it's this date. Well, I know the dates are all wrong because, radioactive decay is not reliable because, the radioactive isotypes, decayed really fast in the first few weeks of creation and then slowed down. And so we can't rely on it. And fossils were put there by the devil or whatever it is. So the data doesn't, they can jury rig it anyway. So I think the bigger thing is for them to see what is the Catholic position. So the idea that the Catholic position is that, evolution is contrary to the faith. That's the bigger thing for them to see. And I think once they are able to grasp that and understand that, or at least see the arguments for that, then that can open things up. And that to me is the biggest thing to debate, and I think the better thing to debate, because creationists, that's what they go for, right? As we said before, they go for, no, like you have to hold this. This is because I've seen a lot of them will say, well, the church fathers, and we have to follow the church fathers, and they didn't believe in evolution. So therefore we can't throw out what the church fathers say. So we know it's a young earth. They all thought it was a young earth. Not all of them did, but most of them thought it was a young earth, so we can't throw that out. So they have these reasons that we can't believe in evolution, and they're all theological reasons. And so I really think discussing the theology is even more important. And I teach an evolution course here at the university. It's mostly bio majors that take it. And so I spend the first lecture just going over what does the church teach about evolution? What does it say in its documents? What have the past popes said? What did John Henry Newman say? How do we think about creation? What does it say about creation? And just sort of frame what is sort of permissible, right? What does the catechism say, about creation and about the way the universe is set up, right? And at least gives them a framework. Now it frees them up to think about that. I think most of the biology majors here, they don't have a problem with evolution. They might not know how it all fits together, but they're not skeptics. But if I teach a survey course for general population, you might get a significant minority of students that have that concern. So when I talk about human evolution, I always start again, here's what the church has said, here's some documents, here's how to think about it. Here's what the church has said about scriptural interpretation, because they often are a little ignorant about that, and so, or have misguided understanding of what the church says about that, just to free up that intellectual space to explore these issues, because I think it's a closed intellectual space often with some of these creationists, and then you can't have a debate. You can't have really good discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the podcast this week on Thinking Faith. I'm sure this is a generic close.
This is the generic close.
The generic close.
I don't know when you need one of those, but if you're hearing it, it's in this circumstance.
It's in this exact circumstance
that you needed a generic close.
And so here we are, having to wrap up some topic that has been scintillatingly interesting.
It must have been great.
It must have been, because you're still here. And it's time to say goodbye. So we, as always, continue to pray that God may bless you and those you love with a faith that is always seeking understanding.
St. Thomas and St. Ignatius,
pray for us.
Amen.
Amen.